You know what's fascinating about 50,000 years ago? If you picked up a human baby from that time and raised them today, they'd be just as smart as anyone you know. Same brain, same potential, same curiosity. But their world was so different from ours that it's almost like looking at an alien planet. This was right in the middle of what we call the Upper Paleolithic period. Humans had been around for about 250,000 years, but something special was happening around this time. These weren't the crude cavemen from old movies, the grunting, club-wielding stereotypes Hollywood loves. These people were creating sophisticated art, developing complex technologies, and building intricate social networks that spanned continents. They were us, just living in a very different world. And when I say different, I mean fundamentally different in ways that challenge everything we think we know about what it means to be human. Think about your daily routine for a moment. You wake up, check your phone, maybe grab some coffee, head to work. Your biggest concern might be traffic or a difficult meeting. Now imagine waking up in a world where your survival depended entirely on your knowledge of the natural world, your relationships with 30 or 40 other people, and your ability to read signs in the environment that could mean the difference between feast and famine, between life and death. But here's the thing, they weren't just surviving. They were thriving in ways that might surprise you. By the end of this video, you'll understand what a typical day looked like for these early humans, how they survived in environments that would challenge us even with modern technology, and why this particular period was such a turning point in human history. We're going to walk through their world season by season, from the ingenious tools they crafted to the stories they told around their fires. We'll explore how they raised their children, what they believed about the world around them, and how they created the first art that still moves us today. This is a journey into a time when being human meant something completely different than it does now. Yet paradoxically, when humans first became truly recognizably modern. The Ice Age world picture Earth 50,000 years ago. Close your eyes for a moment and try to imagine it. We read deep in what scientists call the last glacial maximum approaching, though it wouldn't reach its peak for another 30,000 years. Massive ice sheets, some over a mile thick, covered much of northern Europe and North America. These weren't just thick layers of snow. We were talking about ice formations so massive they actually pressed the land beneath them down into the Earth's crust. The scale of these ice sheets is almost impossible to comprehend. The Laurentide ice sheet that covered most of Canada and the northern United States contained more ice than exists in all of Antarctica today. It was so heavy that it actually caused the Earth's crust to sink hundreds of feet below its normal level. When the ice finally melted, the land would rebound upward, a process that's still happening today in places like Scandinavia. But this wasn't the frozen wasteland you might imagine from movies. The world was a complex mosaic of environments that changed dramatically with the seasons and varied enormously from place to place. Where I am sitting right now in what is now temperate farmland might have been a grassland teeming with massive animals that seem almost mythical today. Woolly mammoths with curved tusks, longer than a car, cave bears that stood 11 feet tall on their hind legs, giant elk with antlers spanning 12 feet from tip to tip. These weren't just larger versions of modern animals. They were entirely different species adapted to this Ice Age world. The cave bear, Ursus spelaeus, was 30% larger than modern grizzly bears and had a skull built for crushing bones that were too tough for other scavengers to handle. The giant beaver, Casteroides ohioensis, was the size of a modern black bear and built dams that created wetland systems covering hundreds of square miles. The woolly rhinoceros, with its distinctive double horn and thick coat, grazed alongside herds of steppe bison that were significantly larger than their modern descendants. Megaloceros, the so-called Irish elk, carried antlers that could span 4 meters and weigh up to 40 kilograms. Display of evolutionary excess that required enormous amounts of energy to grow and maintain each year. The climate was colder and drier than today. Yes, but it was also incredibly rich in wildlife. This was a world where enormous herds of animals migrated across vast distances following the changing seasons. Imagine the American Great Plains during the height of the buffalo herds, but multiply that by 10 and add species that no longer exist. Herds of reindeer, wild horses, and bison that stretched to the horizon. Saber-toothed cats, cave lions, and short-faced bears that made modern grizzlies look small. The predators of this world were equally impressive. The cave lion, Panthera spelaea, was one of the largest cats that ever lived. 25% larger than modern African lions and built for taking down Megafauna. The short-faced bear, Arctodus simus, stood over 12 feet tall on its hind legs and was probably the most formidable predator in North America. Its long legs were built for pursuit rather than climbing, making it essentially a half-ton cheetah. But perhaps most terrifying was the saber-toothed cat, Smilodon fatalis, with its 7-inch canine teeth designed for delivering precision kills to thick-skinned Megafauna. These cats had incredibly powerful shoulders and front legs that could wrestle down prey many times their own size. They hunted in social groups like modern lions, coordinating attacks on animals that would be impossible for solitary predators to bring down. The bird life was equally spectacular. Teratorns, giant condor-like birds with wingspans reaching 17 feet, soared over the landscape searching for carrion from the endless cycle of predation below. Giant eagles with wingspans of 10 feet hunted from cliff faces and mountain peaks. Even the smaller birds were often larger and more robust than their modern relatives, adapted to the harsher climate and different ecological conditions. Sea levels were about 400 feet lower than today because so much water was locked up in those massive ice sheets. This created land bridges that connected continents in ways that seem impossible now. You could walk from Europe to Britain across what is now the English Channel, not across a narrow strip of land, but across a vast plain dotted with rivers and lakes that supported its own unique ecosystem. The Bering Land Bridge that connected Asia and North America wasn't the narrow causeway often depicted in textbooks, but a vast region the size of Texas called Beringia. This was a complete ecosystem with its own climate, plant communities, and animal populations. It had rolling hills, river valleys, and even small mountain ranges. People didn't just cross it. They lived there for thousands of years, developing distinct cultures adapted to this unique environment. And that's exactly what humans were doing, spreading across the globe in one of the greatest migrations in Earth's history. But they weren't desperate refugees fleeing harsh conditions. They were explorers, pioneers, and colonizers who turned environmental challenges into opportunities. The very conditions that made this world so challenging for survival also created opportunities for people who could adapt quickly and think creatively about resource use. The landscapes they moved through were stunningly diverse. In Europe, they encountered vast steppes where the wind never stopped blowing, cold, dry grasslands that supported enormous herds of grazing animals but required different survival strategies than the forested environments their ancestors had known. These steppes stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Ural Mountains, creating a highway for both animals and humans moving between Asia and Europe. The forests that did exist were different too. These were primarily boreal forests, dense stands of spruce, fir, and pine that could survive in the cold climate. These forests were darker and more challenging to navigate than modern woodlands, but they also provided crucial resources. The trees themselves could be used for shelter and tools, while the forest floor supported different types of plants and animals than the open steppes. In what's now Siberia, they adapted to conditions so harsh that the ground stayed permanently frozen just a few feet below the surface. This permafrost created unique challenges for people trying to build shelters, find water, and dispose of waste, but it also created opportunities. Permanently frozen ground could serve as natural refrigeration for storing meat. And the unique plant communities that grew in permafrost regions provided resources that were unavailable in other environments. But perhaps most remarkably, they were beginning to cross open ocean. Around this time, humans reached Australia, which required water crossings of at least 60 miles, even when sea levels were at their lowest. This means they had developed boats sophisticated enough for ocean voyages, a technology that speaks to remarkable planning, cooperation, and understanding of navigation. These weren't accidental crossings by people who got blown off course in simple rafts. Archaeological evidence suggests that people were making intentional voyages to Australia, bringing with them the tools and knowledge needed to establish permanent settlements. They understood ocean currents, weather patterns, and navigation techniques that allowed them to make these crossings successfully and repeatedly. The boats themselves would have been sophisticated craft, probably outrigger canoes or similar multi-hull designs that could handle ocean swells while carrying enough people and supplies for long voyages. Building these boats required cooperation between multiple specialists, people who understood wood selection and preparation, lashing techniques, waterproofing materials, and the design principles that made boats seaworthy. The weather patterns were different too. Storms were more intense, seasonal changes more dramatic. Winter wasn't just colder, it lasted longer and came more suddenly. In many areas, temperatures could drop 50 degrees Fahrenheit within hours as Arctic air masses moved south. These rapid weather changes meant that people had to be constantly prepared for dramatic shifts in conditions. But the storms also brought opportunities. The powerful winds that accompanied these weather systems could be used for long-distance travel by people who understood how to read weather patterns and time their movements accordingly. Lightning strikes from intense storms created natural fires that cleared vegetation and created new habitats for both animals and useful plants. Summer brought opportunities that don't exist in our modern world. With no human development to fragment habitats, animals moved in predictable patterns that humans learned to read like a calendar. These migrations weren't just about following food sources. They were complex ecological events that involved dozens of species moving in coordinated patterns across thousands of miles. The seasonal abundance during summer months was extraordinary. River valleys would be carpeted with flowers that supported enormous populations of insects, which in turn fed vast flocks of migrating birds. Salmon runs in northern rivers brought together predators from hundreds of miles around, creating temporary ecosystems where bears, wolves, eagles, and humans could all find abundant food in the same locations. Our ancestors lived in this world not as victims of harsh conditions, but as master adapters who turned these challenges into opportunities. They developed technologies, social systems, and knowledge bases that allowed them not just to survive, but to spread into virtually every environment on Earth. Within a few thousand years of this period, humans would be living from the Arctic to the tropics, from islands to mountain peaks to desert oases. This adaptability wasn't accidental. It was the result of cognitive abilities that had been developing for hundreds of thousands of years, finally reaching a critical threshold. These people could plan for futures they might never see, cooperate on projects that required coordination across multiple generations, and pass down knowledge that became more sophisticated with each telling. They were developing what we might call ecological intelligence, the ability to understand complex environmental systems and predict how changes in one part of the system would affect other parts. This allowed them to anticipate animal movements, predict weather patterns, and identify new resources in unfamiliar territories. They were also developing social intelligence, the ability to coordinate activities across large groups of people, manage conflicts without violence, and create institutions that could persist across multiple generations. These social innovations were just as important as their technological developments in enabling their spread across the globe. Perhaps most importantly, they were developing cultural intelligence, the ability to create and transmit complex bodies of knowledge that could be preserved and improved across generations. This meant that each new generation didn't have to rediscover basic survival techniques, but could build on the accumulated wisdom of their ancestors. Hunting and gathering, so how did they actually get food? This might be the area where our modern assumptions are most wrong. The popular image of early humans desperately scrounging for survival, barely staying ahead of starvation, is almost completely backwards. These people were incredibly good at making a living from their environment. So good, in fact, that they probably had more leisure time than most people in agricultural societies that came later. Let's follow a typical hunting party on what might seem like an ordinary morning, but which actually represents one of the most sophisticated forms of resource acquisition humans have ever developed. It's early morning, just as the sky begins to lighten with that particular quality of light that experienced. Hunters know means the wind will be still for the next hour. Perfect conditions for approaching wary prey. 5 or 6 people are heading out from their camp, but this isn't a random group thrown together by circumstance. This is a carefully selected team where each person brings specific skills and knowledge that complement the others. There's the tracker, whose understanding of animal behavior borders on supernatural. There's the weapons specialist, who can judge distance and wind conditions with uncanny accuracy. There's the strategist, who can visualize the terrain ahead and predict where animals will move when pressure is applied. But they're not just randomly wandering around hoping to bump into dinner. These people knew their territory in ways we can barely comprehend. Not just the obvious landmarks that any modern hiker might notice, but the subtle signs and seasonal changes that revealed the hidden patterns of animal life. They could read tracks that were days old, understanding not just what animal had passed, but when, how fast it was moving, whether it was injured, what it had been eating, and where it was likely heading. A skilled tracker could tell you the age and sex of an animal from its footprints, whether it was alone or part of a herd, and even something about its health and emotional state. They could distinguish between an animal that was simply moving from one feeding area to another and one that was being pursued by predators. This wasn't mystical knowledge. It was empirical science based on careful observation accumulated over generations. They understood that different animals responded to weather changes in predictable ways, that certain types of vegetation indicated water sources, and that animal behavior patterns changed with the seasons in ways that could be used to predict where prey would be found. They knew that elk preferred south-facing slopes during cold mornings because they would be the first to catch sunlight and begin to warm. They understood that deer would seek shelter in dense vegetation during high winds, but would emerge to feed in open areas when the wind died down. They could predict that bison herds would move toward water sources in the late afternoon, and that the timing of this movement could be influenced by temperature, humidity, and the phase of the moon. When they hunted large game like mammoth, and they did regularly hunt these giants, it was in the desperate struggle often portrayed in movies. It was a coordinated effort that might involve dozens of people and take days or even weeks of planning. They would scout mammoth herds for weeks, learning their movement patterns, identifying vulnerable individuals, and waiting for the right combination of terrain, weather, and animal behavior. They knew exactly which valleys the herds would use during migration, where they could be driven into natural traps, and how to coordinate attacks that minimized risk to human hunters. They had studied the anatomy of these massive animals so thoroughly that they knew exactly where to place spear thrusts for maximum effect, how to use the animal's own weight and momentum against it, and how to avoid the deadly tusks and crushing feet that could kill a human instantly. They developed specialized hunting technologies for different prey that showed remarkable understanding of physics, animal behavior, and material science. For mammoths, they might use spears with detachable points connected to long ropes, allowing hunters to stay at a safe distance while the wounded animal bled out. The spear points were designed to penetrate the thick hide, and then rotate inside the body cavity, creating wounds that wouldn't heal and ensuring that even if the animal initially escaped, it would eventually weaken and die. For smaller game, they had an arsenal of specialized tools that would impress modern hunters. They created snares that could be triggered by the slightest touch, deadfalls that used precisely calculated weights and triggers to ensure clean kills, and throwing sticks that could bring down birds or rabbits with remarkable accuracy. They developed techniques for driving small game into nets, for digging them out of burrows, and for predicting their movements with such precision that they could position themselves for easy shots. They even had techniques for hunting dangerous predators like cave bears and large cats, not because they needed the meat, but because these animals competed for the same prey and posed threats to human communities. They developed bear traps that used the animal's own strength against it, and they knew how to use fire and coordinated group action to drive dangerous predators away from areas where humans wanted to hunt or gather. But here is what might surprise you most. Hunting probably provided only about 30% of their calories. The real specialists, the people who kept these communities fed day after day, were the gatherers, usually women, but not exclusively, who had encyclopedic knowledge of plants that would put modern botanists to shame. A skilled gatherer could identify hundreds of different plants and know exactly when each one was ready for harvest, how to process it for maximum nutrition, and how to preserve it for lean times. They knew which roots were edible in spring before the leaves emerged, which berries ripened in what sequence through the summer, how to leach toxins from nuts, and how to find food even in the depths of winter when most plants were dormant. They understood plant ecology in ways that allowed them to manage wild resources, almost like farmers. They knew that burning certain areas would encourage the growth of useful plants, that harvesting seeds in particular ways would ensure better crops the following year, and that some plants actually became more productive when regularly harvested by humans. They were essentially practicing a form of permaculture, thousands of years before the concept was formally developed. A skilled gatherer could collect 15,000 calories worth of food in a single day, enough to feed a small family for a week. They could do this consistently, day after day, in environments where most modern people would starve within days. They developed techniques for processing foods that multiplied their nutritional value: grinding acorns to remove bitter tannins, fermenting plants to make them more digestible, and combining foods in ways that enhanced their nutritional benefits. But it wasn't just about calories. These people understood nutrition in sophisticated ways that modern science is only beginning to appreciate. They knew that certain combinations of plants provided complete proteins, that some foods needed to be eaten with others to provide essential vitamins, and that different foods were needed at different times of year to maintain health. They understood that spring greens provided essential vitamins after a winter diet heavy in preserved meats and stored plant foods. They knew which plants contained minerals that were often deficient in their diet, and they could identify medicinal plants that could treat specific ailments. They had natural pharmacies that included pain relievers, antibiotics, digestive aids, and treatments for infections that were remarkably effective. They also developed elaborate food storage technologies that allowed them to preserve the abundance of summer and fall harvests for use during the lean winter months. In areas with cold winters, they could preserve meat for months using natural refrigeration, smoking, and drying techniques that removed moisture while preserving nutrients. They made pemmican, a concentrated food combining meat fat and berries that could last for years without spoiling and provided complete nutrition in a compact, portable form. They knew how to smoke fish so that it would remain edible for months, how to dry vegetables while preserving their vitamin content, and how to store nuts in ways that prevented spoilage and pest damage. They developed fermentation techniques that not only preserved food, but actually improved its nutritional value. Fermented plant foods provided probiotics that aided digestion, and the fermentation process could break down toxins and make nutrients more bioavailable. They made fermented fish sauces that provided essential amino acids, and fermented plant pastes that could be stored for months and provided concentrated nutrition during travel. Perhaps most importantly, they developed sophisticated sharing systems that ensured no one went hungry, even when individual hunting or gathering expeditions failed. When someone killed a large animal, there were elaborate protocols for how it was divided, not just to avoid conflict, but to create obligations and relationships that strengthened the entire community. The hunter who made the kill often got some of the least desirable parts, while choice cuts went to elders, families with young children, skilled craftspeople who provided essential services to the community, and anyone who was sick or injured. This wasn't charity. It was an insurance system that guaranteed everyone would be cared for when they needed help. These sharing systems extended beyond just food. Knowledge was freely shared. Tools were loaned, and expertise was taught to anyone willing to learn. A successful hunter would spend hours teaching young people not just techniques, but the deeper understanding of animal behavior that made those techniques effective. A skilled gatherer would take apprentices on collecting expeditions, teaching them not just which plants to harvest, but how to read the landscape to predict where useful resources would be found. This created communities where individual success was meaningless without group success, where hoarding resources was not just antisocial, but actually counterproductive. The person who tried to keep the best hunting spots secret or refused to share knowledge with others would find themselves isolated and without support when they inevitably needed help. These weren't just survival strategies. They were the foundation of human civilization, the beginning of economic systems that would eventually develop into everything from markets to governments. But unlike many later economic systems, these were based on principles of reciprocity and mutual aid rather than competition and accumulation. The result was communities that could sustain themselves indefinitely in environments that would challenge modern people, even with sophisticated technology. They had developed ways of life that were not just sustainable, but regenerative. Their presence in an ecosystem often made it more diverse and productive rather than depleting its resources. The art of survival. Now, let's talk about those tools, because this is where the stereotype of primitive Stone Age people completely falls apart. We tend to think Stone Age means crude and simple, but the technology these people developed was anything but primitive. In many ways, it was more sophisticated than anything humans would create again for thousands of years, representing a level of craftsmanship and engineering that challenges our assumptions about technological progress. Take a Clovis point, one of the spear tips found across North America from this period. To a casual observer, it might look like just a shaped piece of stone, perhaps something that could be made in an afternoon with the right tools. But creating one required understanding the molecular structure of different types of stone, precise control of pressure and angle, the ability to visualize the final product from a raw chunk of flint, and hours of careful work by someone with years of training. The process of making a Clovis point begins with selecting the right type of stone. Not just any rock will do. The napper needs stone that fractures in predictable ways, with grain patterns that can be read and exploited. Obsidian, flint, and chert were preferred materials, but each had different properties that required different techniques. Obsidian could be worked to create edges sharper than modern surgical steel, but it was brittle and required delicate handling. Flint was more durable but harder to work, requiring greater force and different techniques. Modern nappers, people who recreate these tools today, spend years learning what our ancestors taught their children as a matter of course. Even with modern understanding of physics and material science, it's incredibly difficult to reproduce the finest examples of Stone Age toolmaking. Some Solutrean points from Europe are so thin and perfectly shaped that archaeologists initially thought they must be ceremonial because they seemed too delicate for practical use. But wear marks prove they were actually used for hunting, And their thinness was actually a sophisticated engineering solution that made them more effective, not more fragile. These thin points could penetrate deeper into an animal's body, while creating larger wound channels that would cause rapid blood loss. The craftsmanship required to create such delicate yet functional tools represents a level of skill that took decades to master. The napper had to understand not just how to shape stone, but how the finished point would behave when thrust into an animal's body, how it would interact with bone and muscle tissue, and how to design it for maximum lethality while maintaining structural integrity. But stone was just the beginning. These people were masters of composite technology, tools made from multiple materials, carefully combined to create something more effective than any single material could provide. They made spears with wooden shafts, stone points, and sinew bindings that were stronger and more flexible than modern fiberglass fishing rods. The engineering that went into these composite tools was remarkable. The wooden shaft had to be perfectly straight and balanced, carved from wood that had been selected for its specific properties, flexibility for absorbing impact, strength for transmitting force, and straightness for accuracy in flight. Different parts of the shaft might be made from different types of wood, with harder wood at the point of impact and more flexible wood toward the back. The binding that held the point to the shaft wasn't just wrapped around randomly. It followed specific patterns that distributed stress evenly and allowed for controlled flex that would absorb impact without breaking. The sinew used for binding was processed to specific specifications, with different treatments creating different properties. Some sinew was prepared to remain flexible when wet, while other treatments created binding that would shrink as it dried, creating incredibly tight joints. They developed the atlatl, a spear-throwing device that could triple the power and accuracy of a thrown spear. This wasn't just a stick with a hook on the end. It was a precisely engineered lever system that required understanding of physics, biomechanics, and material science. A skilled atlatl user could drive a spear through a mammoth as hide at distances that would be impressive even with modern weapons. The design of an atlatl required understanding complex relationships between lever length, grip position, weight distribution, and flexibility. The best atlatls were custom-made for individual users, taking into account their height, arm length, throwing style, and the specific types of spears they preferred to use. The hook that engaged with the spear had to be positioned at exactly the right angle and height to transfer maximum energy while maintaining accuracy. Master atlatl makers would spend days carving and adjusting each tool, testing it repeatedly and making minute modifications until it performed perfectly. They understood that tiny changes in weight distribution could dramatically affect accuracy, that the flexibility of the atlatl shaft needed to match the user's throwing motion, and that the surface texture of the grip could influence how consistently the tool could be used. They created specialized tools for every imaginable purpose, each representing a sophisticated understanding of materials, engineering, and human ergonomics. They had needles made from bird bones that were finer than anything Europeans would produce until the Industrial Revolution. These needles required hollow bird bones of exactly the right diameter, careful grinding to create the point, and precise drilling to create the eye, all done with stone tools and natural abrasives. The sewing accomplished with these needles was remarkably sophisticated. They could create garments with complex cuts and fitted designs that provided both warmth and freedom of movement. They made waterproof clothing using animal intestines, insulated garments using fur and down, and ceremonial clothing decorated with intricate beadwork and embroidery. They made fishhooks from thorns, bones, and carved shell that could catch everything from tiny minnows to large salmon. Each hook was designed for specific types of fish and fishing conditions. They understood that different hook shapes would appeal to different species, that the weight and balance of the hook affected how it would behave in the water, and that the sharpness and angle of the point determined how successfully it would penetrate and hold. They created nets from plant fibers that could catch everything from small fish to large mammals. These nets weren't just simple weaves. They incorporated complex knotting patterns that distributed stress evenly, used different materials for different parts of the net based on the forces each section would experience, and included sophisticated trigger mechanisms that could be activated by prey animals. They developed harpoons from antler that were precisely engineered for hunting marine mammals and large fish. These harpoons had detachable heads connected to long lines, allowing hunters to maintain contact with wounded prey while staying at a safe distance. The harpoon heads were designed to rotate once they penetrated the target, creating wounds that wouldn't heal and ensuring that the prey couldn't escape. They developed sophisticated techniques for working organic materials that demonstrate remarkable understanding of chemistry and material science. They knew how to bend wood using steam and pressure, creating curved bows that were more powerful and accurate than straight ones. The process of steam bending required precise control of temperature and humidity, understanding of which woods could be bent without breaking, and knowledge of how long to maintain the bend before the wood would hold its new shape permanently. They could join pieces of wood using mortise and tenon joints that were stronger than the wood itself, creating composite tools that combined the best properties of different materials. They understood that different types of wood had different expansion and contraction rates, and they designed their joints to accommodate these changes without loosening over time. They knew how to laminate different materials to create composite tools with properties superior to any single material. They made bows that combined different types of wood, horn, and sinew in carefully designed layers that provided optimal performance. The back of the bow might be made from sinew that was strong in tension, while the belly was made from horn that resisted compression, with a wooden core that provided the basic structure. Their understanding of material science was remarkable. They knew that different types of stone had different properties, that obsidian could be flaked to create edges sharper than modern surgical steel, but was too brittle for heavy-duty work. They knew that certain woods were better for spear shafts, while others were better for making fire. They understood that sinew from different animals had different properties and could be processed in different ways to achieve different results. They developed techniques for treating animal hides that created leather more durable and flexible than many modern synthetic materials. The tanning process they used involved complex chemical treatments using plant extracts, animal brains, and other natural materials that broke down proteins in the hide while preserving its flexibility and strength. Different treatments were used for different purposes. Leather intended for clothing was processed to remain soft and flexible even when wet. Leather for containers needed to be waterproof and able to hold liquids without leaking. Leather for tools needed to be tough and resistant to abrasion. Each treatment required different materials and processes, representing accumulated knowledge about chemistry that had been refined over thousands of years. They also developed chemical technologies that we're only beginning to appreciate. They made adhesives from tree resins and animal products that were waterproof and incredibly strong. These adhesives could bond different materials together permanently, creating composite tools that combine stone, wood, bone, and other materials in ways that maximize the properties of each component. The process of making these adhesives required understanding of chemistry that was remarkably sophisticated. They knew which tree resins could be mixed with which animal products to create adhesives with specific properties. They understood how temperature affected the curing process, how different additives could modify the properties of the final product, and how to apply these adhesives in ways that created the strongest possible bonds. They created dyes from plants and minerals that could color everything from clothing to cave paintings. These dyes weren't just decorative, they often served practical purposes as well. Some plant-based dyes had insect-repelling properties that made treated clothing more comfortable to wear. Others had antimicrobial properties that helped preserve organic materials. The process of creating and applying these dyes required extensive knowledge of chemistry and material science. They understood which mordants were needed to make dyes permanent, how different materials would accept different types of dyes, and how to create specific colors by combining different natural materials. Perhaps most impressively, they understood maintenance and repair in ways that extended the useful life of their tools far beyond what the raw materials would suggest. They could resharpen stone tools multiple times, each resharpening requiring skilled work to maintain the tool's effectiveness while removing as little material as possible. They developed techniques for repairing composite weapons that were damaged in use. A broken spear shaft could be spliced back together using carefully fitted joints and sinew wrapping. A damaged spear point could be reworked into a different type of tool rather than being discarded. They understood that even broken tools contain valuable materials that could be recycled into new implements. Nothing was wasted, everything was recycled, and the total toolkit of a band of 30 people might contain hundreds of specialized implements, each designed for specific tasks and maintained in perfect working condition. This represented not just individual skill, but community-wide knowledge systems that ensured essential tools were always available when needed. They also developed what we might call technology transfer systems that allowed innovations to spread rapidly across vast distances. When someone developed a better way of making a spear point, that innovation wouldn't stay local. It would spread across continents as people traded not just goods, but knowledge. This technology transfer happened through multiple mechanisms. When bands met for seasonal gatherings, skilled craftspeople would demonstrate their techniques to others. Young people who married into different groups would bring their technical knowledge with them. Trade relationships created opportunities for people to examine and copy tools made by distant groups. The result was that technological innovations could spread across thousands of miles within a few generations. A better technique for making arrowheads developed in one area would appear in archaeological sites hundreds of miles away within decades. This suggests not just trade networks, but sophisticated systems for teaching and learning that allowed improvements to be rapidly adopted and adapted to local conditions. These weren't simple tools created by simple people. They were sophisticated technologies that represented thousands of years of accumulated knowledge, careful observation, and continuous innovation. In many ways, they represent human technology at its most elegant, effective, sustainable, and perfectly adapted to their environment. The knowledge required to create and use these tools was vast and integrated. A person needed to understand geology, to find good stone botany, to identify the right wood anatomy, to know how to process sinew and bone physics, to understand how the tools worked chemistry, to create adhesives and treatments and manufacturing techniques that required years to master. Yet this knowledge was so well integrated into daily life that children absorbed it naturally through observation and practice. A child would spend years watching adults make tools, gradually taking on more complex tasks as their skills developed. By adulthood, they would possess technical knowledge that covered dozens of different domains, all seamlessly integrated into a comprehensive understanding of how to create the tools needed for survival. The sophistication of their technology is perhaps best illustrated by the fact that when Europeans first encountered Stone Age peoples in various parts of the world, they were often amazed by the quality and effectiveness of their tools. Native American bows were so superior to European crossbows that many European settlers adopted them. Aboriginal Australian spear throwers were more accurate than early firearms. Inuit kayaks were better adapted to Arctic conditions than any European boat design. Shelter and fire. Let's talk about where they lived, because this is another area where popular misconceptions run wild. The idea that early humans spent most of their time huddled in caves is largely wrong. While rock shelters were certainly used when available, most groups built sophisticated temporary structures that were far more complex and comfortable than most people imagine. In the plains of Eastern Europe, Archaeologists have found the remains of houses made from mammoth bones. Not just a few bones picked up opportunistically, but carefully constructed frameworks that used hundreds of bones arranged in specific architectural patterns. These weren't desperate shelters thrown together for one night. They were engineered structures that could house extended families through entire winters. The construction of these mammoth bone houses required remarkable planning and cooperation. The builders had to understand structural engineering well enough to create stable frameworks from irregularly shaped materials. They needed to coordinate the hunting of multiple mammoths, the transportation of massive bones over considerable distances, and the assembly of structures that could withstand months of harsh weather. These houses typically had central hearths, sleeping areas for multiple families, and storage spaces for food and tools. Some had elaborate entrance passages that helped maintain interior temperatures and keep out wind and snow. The largest could accommodate 20 or more people and their equipment through an entire winter season. In other environments, they built different types of shelters adapted to local conditions and available materials. In forested areas, they constructed lean-tos and A-frame structures using wooden poles, bark, and animal hides. These could be assembled quickly by experienced builders and provided excellent protection from rain and wind. In areas with limited building materials, they dug pit houses, semi-underground structures that used Earth's natural insulation to maintain comfortable temperatures year-round. Some of these were quite elaborate, with multiple rooms, raised sleeping platforms, and sophisticated ventilation systems. The key principle behind all of these structures was mobility. Unlike modern buildings designed to last for decades, these shelters were designed to be assembled quickly when the group moved, which they did regularly following animal migrations and seasonal resources. But this didn't mean they were crude or uncomfortable. A skilled group could erect a weather-tight shelter for 15 people in a few hours using materials they carried with them or could gather locally. These structures were often more comfortable than anything Europeans would build for centuries, warmer, drier, and better ventilated than medieval peasant houses. And then there's fire, perhaps the most important technology humans ever developed. These people didn't just use fire. They were fire masters in ways that would put most modern camping enthusiasts to shame. They could start fires in rain, snow, or wind using techniques that many of us couldn't replicate today, even with modern tools. They knew dozens of different methods for making fire, each suited to different conditions and available materials. They could use fire plows, bow drills, flint, and steel, and techniques involving fire pistons that created combustion through compression. They understood tinder, kindling, and fuel in ways that allowed them to create sustainable fires even in the most challenging conditions. They knew how to bank fires to last all night without constant attention, how to use different types of wood for different purposes, and how to manage smoke to keep insects away, preserve food, or signal to other groups across long distances. They could create specialized fires for cooking, heating, light, and manufacturing that burned at exactly the right temperature for each purpose. Fire wasn't just about warmth and cooking, though those were certainly important. It was their television, their security system, their workshop, and their community center all rolled into one. Around the fire, they told stories, made tools, planned hunts, and maintained the social bonds that held their communities together. They developed sophisticated techniques for using fire as a tool for environmental management. They knew that controlled burns could clear undergrowth to make travel easier, encourage the growth of useful plants, and drive game animals in predictable directions. Some archaeologists believe that human use of fire actually helped create and maintain some of the grassland environments that supported the large herds they depended on. Fire also enabled them to expand into environments that would otherwise be uninhabitable. Without fire, humans could never have survived northern winters or spread into high-altitude environments. Fire allowed them to cook foods that would otherwise be inedible, sterilize water, and create light that extended their active hours well beyond daylight. Perhaps most importantly, fire was the center of social life. The hearth was where the community gathered every evening, where children learned by listening to adult conversations, where disputes were resolved, and where the cultural knowledge of the group was transmitted from one generation to the next. The management of fire was often a communal responsibility, with different people taking turns maintaining the fires through the night, gathering fuel, and ensuring that the embers were properly banked for easy rekindling. In some groups, certain individuals specialized in fire making and were responsible for carrying fire from camp to camp during migrations. The sophistication of their fire technology is evident in archaeological sites where researchers have found elaborate hearths with built-in reflectors to maximize heat distribution, chimney systems to improve ventilation, and carefully designed fire pits that minimized fuel consumption while maximizing heat output. Social bonds and community. This brings us to something absolutely crucial that distinguishes these people from the isolated, brutish stereotype. They lived in sophisticated social groups with complex relationships that extended far beyond their immediate families. A typical band might have 25 to 50 people, large enough to handle big collaborative tasks like mammoth hunts or shelter construction, small enough that everyone knew everyone else intimately and could coordinate activities without formal hierarchy. But they weren't isolated groups wandering aimlessly across the landscape. These bands were part of larger networks that could span hundreds of miles, connecting thousands of people in loose but important relationships. They met regularly at certain locations, seasonal camps where multiple bands would gather for trade, marriages, ceremonies, and information exchange. These gatherings were incredibly important for both practical and social reasons. They allowed young people to find marriage partners outside their immediate group, preventing inbreeding and maintaining genetic diversity. They enabled the exchange of tools, raw materials, and finished goods that no single band could produce or acquire on its own. A spear point made in what's now France has been found in archaeological sites in Germany. Shells from the Mediterranean show up in caves hundreds of miles inland. Amber from the Baltic appears in sites across Central Europe. But these gatherings were about more than just trade. They were opportunities for sharing knowledge, learning new techniques, and maintaining the cultural connections that held larger populations together. A hunting technique developed by one band could be shared with dozens of others. Stories, songs, and artistic styles could spread across continents. The social organization within bands was remarkably egalitarian by historical standards. While there were certainly individuals with special skills or knowledge who commanded respect, there were no kings or permanent rulers. Leadership was often situational. The best tracker might lead during hunting expeditions, while someone else might take charge during tool-making sessions or ceremonies. They had complex rules about sharing that went far beyond simple reciprocity. When someone killed a large animal, there were elaborate protocols for how it was divided. Protocols that varied from group to group, but always served to strengthen social bonds rather than simply distribute food. The hunter who made the kill often received some of the least desirable parts, while choice cuts went to elders, families with young children, skilled craftspeople, and anyone who was sick or injured. This wasn't charity or socialism in any modern sense. It was an insurance system that guaranteed everyone would be cared for when they needed help. The successful hunter today might be the injured person tomorrow who needed support from the community. By sharing success, individuals ensured that the group would share their failures as well. These sharing systems created intricate webs of obligation and reciprocity that held communities together across generations. Someone who received help during illness would remember that debt and repay it when opportunity arose. Children who were fed by the community grew up understanding their responsibilities to support others. The social knowledge required to navigate these relationships was enormous. Everyone needed to keep track of kinship relationships, extending back multiple generations, remember who owed what to whom, and understand the subtle social rules that governed interaction between different individuals and families. They developed sophisticated techniques for resolving conflicts without violence. Disputes over resources, marriage partners, or social obligations were handled through community discussion, formal debates, or ritualized competitions. In many groups, shamans or other spiritual leaders served as mediators who could invoke supernatural authority to resolve particularly difficult conflicts. The punishment for serious violations of social norms was usually ostracism, being cast out from the group. In an environment where survival depended on cooperation, this was effectively a death sentence, which made it a powerful deterrent against antisocial behavior. They also developed elaborate systems for caring for individuals who couldn't care for themselves. Archaeological evidence shows that people with severe disabilities, chronic illnesses, or major injuries were supported by their communities for years or even decades. There are Neanderthal skeletons showing evidence of careful nursing through long illnesses, and early modern human sites with burials of individuals who clearly required extensive care from others. Children were considered everyone's responsibility, not just their biological parents. Adults without children of their own would help care for and educate the children of others. This distributed the enormous workload of child-rearing and ensured that all children had access to the specialized knowledge of different adults. The elderly were particularly valued for their knowledge and experience. In societies without writing, older individuals were living libraries who carried decades of accumulated wisdom about weather patterns, animal behavior, and survival techniques. Their stories weren't just entertainment. They were educational tools that transmitted crucial information across generations. The birth of art and storytelling. Here's where things get truly remarkable, where we see evidence of human consciousness expanding in ways that still give researchers chills. Around 45,000 years ago, something happened that archaeologists call the symbolic revolution or creative explosion. Humans started creating art, not just crude scratches or accidental marks, but sophisticated artistic expressions that show advanced planning, symbolic thinking, and aesthetic sensibility. I'm not talking about primitive cave paintings that look like children's drawings. The art from this period is breathtaking in its sophistication. The paintings in caves like Lascaux, Altamira, and Javet show an understanding of perspective, movement, and composition that rivals anything produced by professional artists today. These were accidental masterpieces created by one exceptionally talented individual. They represent artistic traditions that were maintained and developed over thousands of years. The artists who created these works understood how to use multiple colors made from various minerals and organic compounds. They knew how to prepare pigments that would maintain their color for tens of thousands of years. They developed brushes from animal hair, learned to blow pigments through hollow bones to create airbrush effects, and discovered how to use the natural contours of cave walls to create three-dimensional illusions. Some of these paintings show animals in motion with such accuracy that they could serve as textbooks for animal anatomy. The horses, bison, and mammoths depicted in caves like Javet move across the walls with flowing grace that captures not just their physical form, but their essential character as living beings. But perhaps most remarkably, these artists understood and used techniques that wouldn't be rediscovered in European art until the Renaissance. They used perspective to create depth, overlapping figures to show multiple animals, and even primitive animation sequences where slightly different images painted in sequence create the illusion of movement when viewed by flickering firelight. They were also creating portable art, small sculptures, decorated tools, and jewelry that they carried with them as they moved across the landscape. The Venus figurines found across Europe are particularly intriguing. These small sculptures of women, carved from stone, bone, or ivory, show remarkable consistency in style across vast distances and long periods of time. Some researchers interpret these figurines as goddess figures representing fertility or abundance. Others see them as self-portraits created by women, or as teaching tools used to educate young people about human reproduction. What is clear is that they required considerable skill to create and were important enough that people invested significant time and effort in making them. They made jewelry from shells, teeth, and carved bone that shows sophisticated understanding of design and decoration. Some pieces required hours of careful work to create tiny perforations for stringing, or elaborate carved patterns that serve no functional purpose beyond beauty. They created musical instruments, flutes made from bird bones that could play complex melodies, drums from animal hides, and percussion instruments from various materials. Some of these instruments could produce sounds across multiple octaves and were clearly designed for making music, not just noise. But maybe most importantly, they were telling stories. We can't hear their voices anymore, but the evidence for rich oral traditions is everywhere. The way similar artistic styles spread across vast distances suggests that people were sharing not just techniques, but stories that carried cultural meaning. The placement of paintings in specific parts of caves, often in hard-to-reach chambers that required crawling through narrow passages, suggests these weren't casual decorations, but important ceremonial sites where stories were told and retold. Many cave paintings show repeated symbols and motifs that appear across multiple sites. Handprints, geometric patterns, and stylized representations of animals and humans create a visual vocabulary that seems to carry meaning beyond simple representation. These may have been the earliest writing systems, ways of recording important information in permanent form. The stories these people told weren't just entertainment. They were educational tools that transmitted crucial survival information across generations. A story about animal behavior could teach young hunters what to expect from different prey species. A tale about weather patterns could help people prepare for seasonal changes. Stories about geography could serve as maps that helped travelers navigate across unfamiliar territory. They also developed stories that helped explain their world and their place in it. The human-animal hybrid figures found in many cave paintings might represent shamans or spiritual beings that featured in creation myths or religious stories. These weren't primitive superstitions, but sophisticated attempts to understand complex relationships between humans, animals, and the natural world. The sophistication of their storytelling is evident in the way artistic traditions were maintained across multiple generations. Caves that were painted over periods of thousands of years show consistent styles and themes, suggesting that stories and artistic conventions were being passed down through cultural transmission with remarkable fidelity. These oral traditions would have been performed around fires during long winter nights, with master storytellers using voice, gesture, and perhaps music to bring their tales to life. Children would have grown up immersed in these stories, learning not just facts but values, beliefs, and cultural identity through narrative. The development of art and storytelling during this period represents a fundamental shift in human consciousness. For the first time, people were creating things that served no immediate survival function, but were valued for their beauty, meaning, or cultural significance. This suggests that humans had developed the cognitive surplus necessary to think beyond immediate needs and invest time and energy in activities that enrich their mental and spiritual lives. Following the Essayasoans, these people lived their lives according to rhythms we've almost completely forgotten in our climate-controlled, artificially lit modern world. Their calendar wasn't based on arbitrary dates imposed by distant authorities, but on the real changes happening in the natural world around them, changes they could see, feel, and smell every day. Spring was perhaps the most crucial time of year, when survival through winter gave way to new opportunities and challenges. As temperatures began to rise and daylight hours increased, these communities underwent dramatic transformations. Winter camps that had housed 30 or 40 people for months would break up into smaller groups as families headed in different directions, following their various subsistence strategies. The first task of spring was always assessment, checking on cached food supplies, evaluating the condition of tools and equipment after months of heavy use, and taking stock of who had survived the winter and in what condition. This was when difficult decisions were made about caring for elderly or sick individuals who might not survive another year, and when young people who had reached maturity during the long winter months were formally recognized as adults. Spring was also when the great migrations began. Many groups would pack up their winter settlements and begin following migrating herds northward as the animals moved towards summer feeding grounds. This wasn't a desperate chase for survival, but a carefully planned journey that had been refined over generations. They knew exactly which routes the herds would take, where they would stop to feed or rest, and when they would arrive at various landmarks. They had favorite camping spots along these migration routes, places with good water, shelter, and strategic positions for hunting. Some of these sites show evidence of use for thousands of years, with layer upon layer of archaeological deposits, recording countless spring migrations. Spring was also the season for gathering the first edible plants of the year. Women and children would fan out across the landscape collecting emerging shoots, early greens, and the roots of plants that had stored energy through the winter underground. These early plants were crucial for health after months of a meat-heavy winter diet, providing vitamins and minerals that had been scarce during the cold months. Summer brought different opportunities and challenges. This was the time for long-distance expeditions, trading journeys that might cover hundreds of miles, exploration of new territories, and the large communal hunts that could only be organized when multiple bands came together. Summer was also when most intergroup socializing occurred. The seasonal camps where multiple bands gathered weren't just convenient meeting places. They were carefully chosen locations with abundant resources that could support large populations for extended periods. These gatherings might last for weeks, with hundreds of people camping together in one area. These summer gatherings were crucial for maintaining the genetic and cultural health of the population. Young people would find marriage partners from other bands, preventing inbreeding and ensuring genetic diversity. Knowledge would be shared between groups, new hunting techniques, improved tool designs, better methods for processing food or making clothing. Summer was also the peak season for artistic and ceremonial activities. The cave paintings that survive today were often created during these gatherings, when specialist artists from different groups could work together and share techniques. The elaborate bone and antler carvings found at many sites probably represent summer crafts, projects when people had more leisure, time, and access to specialized materials. Fall was perhaps the most frantic time of year, when everything focused on preparation for the coming winter. This was when the great communal hunts took place, coordinated efforts involving dozens of hunters working together to drive entire herds of animals into carefully prepared killing grounds. These fall hunts could provide meat for entire communities through the winter months, but they required enormous coordination and planning. Hunters had to work together to construct drive lanes, lines of stone, cairns, or brush piles that would funnel animals toward cliff edges or pit traps. They had to time their hunts to coincide with animal migrations and favorable weather conditions. The processing of meat from these hunts was a community-wide effort that could take weeks. Every part of the animal was used. Meat was cut into strips and dried. Bones were processed for marrow and tool-making materials. Hides were scraped and prepared for clothing and shelter, and sinew was extracted for thread and rope. Fall was also the peak season for plant gathering. Nuts, berries, and seeds that would ripen through late summer and early fall had to be collected, processed, and stored for winter use. Different plants ripened in sequence throughout the fall, requiring detailed knowledge of timing and location to gather each at its peak. Nutritional value. Winter was a time of intensive social life when communities were confined together for months by harsh weather. This wasn't a period of hibernation or desperate survival, but a time for the activities that could only be done when people had the leisure for careful, detailed work. Winter was the season for storytelling, when master storytellers would spend hours each evening entertaining their audiences with tales that transmitted cultural knowledge, values, and history. Children would learn not just facts but the deeper meanings embedded in narrative tradition. It was also the prime time for tool making and craft production. The finest stone tools, the most elaborate bone carvings, and the most sophisticated clothing were often produced during winter months when people had time for careful, detailed work. This was when knowledge was transmitted from master craftspeople to apprentices. When techniques were refined and innovations developed, winter was the season for planning, for discussing the coming year's activities, evaluating the success of past strategies, and making decisions about group composition and territorial boundaries. These weren't casual conversations, but formal decision-making processes that would affect the survival and prosperity of the entire community. The seasonal round wasn't just about survival. It was about living in harmony with natural cycles that connected these people to their environment in ways we can barely understand today. They didn't fight against nature or try to control it, but worked with natural patterns and rhythms in ways that were both sustainable and deeply satisfying. Raising the next generation children in these societies weren't just small adults waiting to grow up, nor were they precious innocents to be protected from the harsh realities of life. They were integrated into community life from birth, learning through observation, participation, and guided practice in ways that modern educational theory is only beginning to appreciate. From the earliest age, children were immersed in a rich sensory environment that provided constant learning opportunities. A baby carried on its mother's back during gathering expeditions would absorb information about plants, weather patterns, and animal behavior long before they could consciously understand what they were learning. The sounds, smells, and sights of daily life created a foundation of environmental knowledge that would prove crucial later in life. By the age of 3 or 4, children were already beginning to contribute meaningfully to community life. They could help gather certain types of plants, assist with simple tool maintenance, and participate in food preparation activities appropriate to their age and abilities. This wasn't child labor in any exploitative sense. It was education through participation, learning by doing the real work that kept a community alive. A 5-year-old in these societies would already know dozens of plants by sight, smell, and taste. They could identify animal tracks, understand basic weather signs, and perform simple tasks with stone tools. They knew which adults in the community had specialized knowledge about different subjects and could seek them out when they wanted to learn specific skills. By age 10, children could contribute significantly to food gathering and preparation. They might not yet be trusted with the most complex hunting techniques or the finest tool making, but they could process plant foods, help with hide preparation, and assist in the construction of shelters and other community infrastructure. The education these children received was remarkably comprehensive. They learned not just practical skills, but the complex social knowledge necessary to navigate community relationships. They understood kinship systems that might extend across multiple generations and geographic regions. They knew the histories of different families, the obligations and rights that governed interaction between individuals, and the subtle social cues that indicated mood, intention, and status. They also received intensive training in environmental observation that would put most modern naturalists to shame. Children learned to read the landscape like a book, understanding what different cloud formations meant for weather, what animal behaviors indicated about seasonal changes, and how to predict where resources would be available based on subtle environmental cues. But childhood wasn't all work and education. These communities understood that play was a crucial form of learning. Children had toys, carved animals, small versions of adult tools, games that taught hunting and gathering skills while entertaining the participants. They learned through stories that encoded practical knowledge in memorable, enjoyable formats. Many of the games children played were sophisticated simulations of adult activities. They played hunting games that taught tracking, coordination, and strategic thinking. They had gathering competitions that helped them learn to identify and efficiently collect various plants. They engaged in storytelling contests that developed their memory and narrative. Skills that the transition from childhood to adulthood was marked by elaborate coming-of-age rituals that officially recognized young people's readiness to take on adult responsibilities. These weren't arbitrary ceremonies, but genuine tests of competence that demonstrated mastery of essential survival skills. For young men, this might involve solo hunting expeditions where they had to survive alone for days or weeks, using only their own skills and knowledge. They might be required to make a complete set of tools from raw materials, track and kill a large animal, or demonstrate their ability to navigate across unfamiliar territory. For young women, the tests might focus more on gathering expertise, food processing skills, or the complex social knowledge needed to maintain community relationships. They might be required to identify and process hundreds of different plants, demonstrate their ability to prepare various types of food, or show their competence in craft production. But these gender distinctions weren't absolute. All young people, regardless of sex, were expected to master basic survival skills that would allow them to contribute to community welfare. Women often participated in hunting, especially for smaller game, and men were expected to know enough about plant gathering to supplement their diet when necessary. The survival rate for children was actually much higher than many people assume. While infant mortality was certainly higher than in modern developed countries, once children survived their first year, they had a good chance of reaching adulthood. The community investment in children was enormous, with multiple adults taking responsibility for each child's education and welfare. Children who showed special aptitude for particular skills were often apprenticed to master practitioners who could provide advanced training. A child who demonstrated exceptional tracking ability might be taken under the wing of the community's best hunter. One who showed artistic talent might be taught by skilled toolmakers or cave painters. This created a system where knowledge and expertise were continuously transmitted across generations, but also where innovations and improvements could be rapidly adopted. Children learned traditional techniques from their elders, but they also brought fresh perspectives that could lead to new discoveries and better methods. The emotional and psychological development of children was also carefully nurtured. Children grew up with strong attachments, not just to their biological parents, but to extended networks of adults who served as teachers, protectors, and role models. This distributed child-rearing system ensured that children always had multiple sources of support and guidance. Children also developed strong bonds with their age peers, forming friendships and alliances that would last throughout their lives. These peer relationships provided emotional support during the challenging transition to adulthood and created social networks that would prove valuable throughout their adult lives. The result was young adults who were remarkably competent and self-reliant by modern standards, but who were also deeply embedded in community relationships that provided both support and responsibility. They understood their place in the social and natural world, possessed sophisticated practical skills, and carried forward the cultural knowledge that would ensure their community's survival and prosperity. What's perhaps most Remarkable about this educational system is how it managed to balance individual development with collective responsibility. Unlike modern educational systems that often struggle to accommodate different learning styles and abilities, these ancient communities seem to have intuitively understood that children learn in fundamentally different ways and at different paces. Some children were visual learners who absorbed information best through observation and demonstration. Others were kinesthetic learners who needed hands-on experience to master new skills. Still others were auditory learners who thrived on storytelling and oral instruction. The multifaceted nature of daily life in these communities meant that all these learning styles were naturally accommodated within the same educational framework. The apprenticeship systems that developed were particularly sophisticated in their understanding of skill development. Master practitioners didn't just demonstrate techniques. They created carefully structured learning progressions that built complex abilities step by step. A young person learning to make stone tools, for instance, wouldn't start by trying to create finished implements. They would begin by learning to recognize different types of stone, understanding how fracture patterns worked, and practicing basic striking techniques on practice pieces. This progression-based learning meant that by the time young people were creating their first functional tools, they had already internalized the underlying principles that made good craftsmanship possible. They understood not just how to perform specific techniques, but why those techniques worked and how they could be adapted to different situations or materials. Psychological sophistication of these educational approaches is evident in how communities handled children who showed signs of what we might today call learning difficulties or developmental differences. Archaeological evidence suggests that individuals with physical disabilities or cognitive differences were not excluded from community life, but were found meaningful roles that utilized their particular strengths and abilities. Some individuals who might have struggled with typical hunting or gathering activities became specialists in other areas, perhaps serving as toolmakers who could work with fine detail, story keepers who maintained oral traditions, or weather watchers who tracked environmental patterns. This inclusive approach meant that the community benefited from the full range of human cognitive and physical diversity. The development of specialized knowledge keepers represents another dimension of educational sophistication. Certain individuals became living libraries who memorized vast amounts of cultural information, genealogies, migration routes, resource locations, weather patterns, astronomical cycles, and mythological narratives. These human databases were crucial for community survival and cultural continuity. Training these knowledge keepers required educational techniques that modern pedagogy is only beginning to understand. Information was embedded in complex narrative structures that made it easier to memorize and harder to forget. Geographic knowledge was encoded in journey songs that could guide travelers across hundreds of miles of territory. Astronomical observations were preserved in mythological stories that tracked celestial cycles across multiple generations. The emotional and social intelligence that children developed in these communities was equally remarkable. Growing up in small groups where everyone knew everyone else meant that children learned to read subtle social cues, understand complex relationship dynamics, and navigate potential conflicts before they escalated into serious problems. Children learn to recognize the early warning signs of social tension, changes in body language, tone of voice, or behavioral patterns that indicated when individuals or groups were becoming stressed or upset. They developed intervention skills that could diffuse conflicts through humor, distraction, or gentle mediation. These social competencies were just as crucial for survival as practical skills like hunting or tool making. The Integration of spiritual and practical education was another distinctive feature of these educational systems. Children didn't learn about the natural world as a collection of separate facts, but as an interconnected spiritual and physical reality where practical knowledge and religious understanding were inseparable. A child learning to track animals wasn't just memorizing footprint patterns. They were learning to understand animal consciousness, to predict animal behavior based on spiritual as well as physical factors, and to approach hunting as a form of spiritual communication rather than simple predation. This holistic worldview created a depth of environmental understanding that went far beyond mere technical knowledge. The resilience these educational systems created in young people was extraordinary. Children who grew up in these communities developed what psychologists today call adaptive expertise, the ability to apply their knowledge and skills flexibly in new situations rather than just reproducing learned behaviors mechanically. This adaptability was crucial for communities that regularly face novel challenges, climate changes, resource fluctuations, encounters with new environments or other human groups. Young adults who had been educated in these traditional rituals and beliefs. These people developed the world's first religions, and the archaeological evidence suggests these belief systems were far more sophisticated than the crude animism or ancestor worship we might expect from primitive societies. They created complex spiritual frameworks that helped them understand their place in the cosmos, provided meaning for their daily experiences, and created social cohesion that extended far beyond practical cooperation. The evidence for their spiritual lives comes from multiple sources, but perhaps the most compelling is their treatment of the dead. They buried their dead with careful attention to body position, orientation, and grave goods that suggest detailed beliefs about the afterlife and a continuation of existence beyond death. These weren't simple pit burials where bodies were hastily covered with dirt. Many graves show evidence of elaborate preparation, with bodies positioned in specific ways, sometimes with their knees drawn up to their chests in fetal positions, sometimes laid out fully extended with their heads pointing in particular directions. The consistency of burial practices within communities suggests these weren't random choices, but elements of coherent belief systems. The grave goods buried with the dead provide fascinating insights into their spiritual beliefs. Bodies were often accompanied by tools, weapons, jewelry, and food, suggesting beliefs that the deceased would need these items in some form of afterlife. But the selection of grave goods wasn't random. Certain types of objects appear repeatedly in burials, while others that were common in daily life are rarely found in graves. Some burials included elaborate personal ornaments that must have required enormous amounts of time and skill to create. These weren't everyday items, but special objects that may have had ritual significance or indicated social status. The famous Red Lady of Caveman, actually a young man whose bones were stained red with ochre, was buried with ivory rods, perforated shells, and other exotic items that had been transported from distant locations. The use of ochre, red iron oxide, in burials is particularly interesting because it appears in sites across the globe, from Europe to Australia to Africa. This suggests that the symbolic association of red pigment with death and rebirth may be one of humanity's oldest religious concepts. They had sacred places that went far beyond simple burial grounds. The decorated caves that contain the world's earliest art weren't living spaces, but special locations reserved for ceremonies and rituals. The placement of paintings deep underground, often in chambers that required crawling through narrow passages to reach, suggests these were sacred spaces where important spiritual activities took place. Many of these painted caves show evidence of acoustic properties that would have enhanced ritual activities. Chambers with particularly spectacular paintings often have natural acoustics that amplify sound, creating echoing effects that would have made music, chanting, or storytelling more powerful and emotionally affecting. The paintings themselves often seem to depict more than simple representations of animals. Many show human-animal hybrid figures that may represent shamans or spiritual beings. These figures often combine human bodies with animal heads, or show humans wearing animal masks or costumes. This suggests beliefs in spiritual transformation, shape-shifting, or communication between human and animal worlds. They develop concepts of the supernatural that helped explain natural phenomena and provided frameworks for understanding their relationship with the environment. The elaborate cave paintings may represent spiritual journeys, creation myths, or maps of supernatural territories that shamans visited during trance states. Archaeological evidence suggests that some individuals may have served as specialized religious practitioners, shamans, priests, or spiritual leaders who mediated between the human community and the supernatural world. Some burials contain unusual collections of objects that might have been shamanic equipment, carved figures, unusual stones, containers for pigments or other ritual substances. The famous sorcerer figure from the cave of the Trois Frères in France shows a human figure with animal characteristics presiding over a chamber filled with animal paintings. This may represent a shamanic figure who was believed to have special relationships with animal spirits or the ability to ensure successful hunting through spiritual intervention. They also developed ritual practices that brought communities together for shared spiritual experiences. The handprints found in many painted caves were clearly created during group ceremonies, with people of all ages placing their hands on cave walls and blowing pigment around them to create permanent records of their presence. These handprint ceremonies may have been initiation rituals where young people were formally introduced to sacred spaces and spiritual knowledge. The placement of handprints often requires climbing or reaching into difficult positions, suggesting that creating them was itself a form of ritual challenge or test. They developed concepts of sacred time and space that distinguished ritual activities from ordinary daily life. Certain locations, times of year, or phases of the moon may have been considered especially appropriate for spiritual activities. The seasonal gatherings, where multiple bands came together, may have included important ceremonial components that reinforced shared beliefs and cultural identity. Their spiritual beliefs weren't abstract philosophies divorced from practical life, but integrated worldviews that provided guidance for daily decisions, seasonal activities, and social relationships. Spiritual beliefs influenced hunting practices, food sharing, conflict resolution, and community decision-making in ways that made religion an essential component of survival strategy. They may have developed concepts of reciprocal relationships with animal spirits, believing that successful hunting required spiritual as well as practical preparation. This might explain the careful treatment of animal bones found at many sites, where certain bones were arranged in specific patterns or treated in ways that suggest ritual significance. These weren't primitive superstitions, but sophisticated belief systems that provided meaning, social cohesion, and practical guidance for communities living in challenging environments. They created the conceptual foundations for all later religious developments, establishing patterns of spiritual thought and practice that would influence human culture for tens of thousands of years. The development of religious beliefs during this period represents another dimension of the cognitive revolution that made humans truly modern. For the first time, People were thinking systematically about abstract concepts like souls, afterlives, and supernatural beings. They were creating symbolic systems that could represent invisible realities and developing ritual practices that reinforced social bonds and cultural identity. What's particularly fascinating is how these early religious systems may have served as humanity's first information storage and transmission networks. Before writing, complex spiritual narratives functioned as sophisticated databases that encoded essential survival information within memorable stories. Creation myths preserved geological knowledge about local landscapes. Flood stories contained meteorological data about seasonal patterns. And animal spirit tales embedded detailed behavioral observations that were crucial for successful hunting. The ritual calendars these people developed represent some of humanity's earliest attempts at systematic timekeeping and astronomical observation. Archaeological evidence from sites like Newgrange in Ireland and Göbekli Tepe in Turkey shows that these ancient peoples were tracking solar and lunar cycles with remarkable precision, creating ritual schedules that align ceremonies with seasonal changes, animal migrations, and agricultural cycles. These weren't just practical scheduling systems. They represented a profound conceptual leap in understanding time as something that could be measured, predicted, and controlled through human activity. The ability to plan ritual activities months or even years in advance required abstract thinking about temporal relationships that went far beyond immediate survival needs. The social implications of these early religious systems were equally revolutionary. Shared spiritual beliefs created bonds between communities that extended far beyond kinship relationships, enabling cooperation between groups that might otherwise have been competitors or enemies. Religious festivals and ceremonies provided neutral ground where different bands could meet safely for trade, made exchange and information sharing. These gatherings also served as crucial innovation hubs where new technologies, artistic techniques, and cultural practices could spread rapidly across vast geographic regions. The remarkable consistency of artistic styles and ritual practices across thousands of miles of territory suggests that religious networks were functioning as highways for cultural transmission. The emergence of specialized religious practitioners, shamans, priests, or spiritual leaders represents another dimension of increasing social complexity. These individuals weren't just part-time ritual specialists, but full-time religious professionals who were supported by their communities in exchange for spiritual services. This represents one of humanity's first experiments with economic specialization beyond basic survival tasks. Archaeological evidence suggests these religious specialists possessed detailed knowledge of medicinal plants, astronomical cycles, and psychological techniques for inducing altered states of consciousness. They were essentially humanity's first scientists, doctors, and psychologists, using empirical observation and systematic experimentation to understand natural and supernatural phenomena. The development of trance-inducing practices through rhythmic music, repetitive movement, sensory deprivation, or psychoactive substances allowed these early humans to explore altered states of consciousness in systematic ways. The cave paintings that seem to depict hallucinogenic experiences suggest they were conducting sophisticated investigations into the nature of consciousness itself. These explorations of inner reality were as important as their investigations of the external world. They were developing concepts of multiple levels of reality, distinguishing between ordinary waking consciousness and spiritual states where different kinds of knowledge became accessible. This represented a fundamental expansion in understanding what it means to be human and conscious. The ritual use of music and dance during this period appears to have been far more sophisticated than simple entertainment or emotional expression. Archaeological evidence of carefully crafted musical instruments, bone flutes with precise hole placements for specific musical scales, drums with acoustically designed chambers, and rattles with carefully selected materials, suggests these people understood the psychological and physiological effects of different sounds and rhythms. They may have discovered that certain musical frequencies could induce trance states, enhance memory formation, or create feelings of social bonding and emotional unity. This knowledge would have made their rituals incredibly powerful tools for social cohesion and cultural transmission. The artistic and symbolic systems they developed weren't just decorative or expressive, they were sophisticated communication technologies that could convey complex information across time and space. The geometric patterns, animal figures, and abstract symbols found in their art may represent early forms of writing or notation systems that recorded important cultural knowledge in visual form. These visual languages were probably much more information-dense than we currently understand. What appears to us as simple animal drawings may actually be complex narratives that encoded detailed information about hunting strategies, seasonal behaviors, territorial boundaries, or spiritual relationships. The full meaning of these symbolic systems died with their creators, leaving us with only fragments of what were probably incredibly rich communication networks. The religious innovations of this period established conceptual frameworks that would influence human spiritual development for tens of thousands of years. They created the first systematic approaches to questions about meaning, purpose, morality, and humanity's relationship with forces beyond immediate control. These weren't just survival strategies, but genuine attempts to understand the deepest mysteries of existence, questions that continue to occupy human consciousness today. The human revolution. And so, what made this period so special? Why do archaeologists call it a revolution rather than just another stage in human development? The answer lies in understanding that around 50,000 years ago, something fundamental changed in human consciousness, not our basic intelligence, which had been developing for hundreds of thousands of years, but our ability to think and behave in ways that were fully modern. This wasn't a sudden transformation that happened overnight, but it was remarkably rapid in evolutionary terms. Within a few thousand years, humans went from being very intelligent animals with sophisticated tool use to being creatures capable of abstract thought, symbolic communication, artistic expression, and complex social organization. The evidence for this transformation is everywhere once you know how to look for it. Before about 50,000 years ago, human technology remained relatively static for long periods. The same basic tool types appear in archaeological sites for tens of thousands of years with only minor modifications. After this period, technological innovation accelerated dramatically, with new tool types appearing and spreading rapidly across vast distances. The same pattern appears in every aspect of human behavior. Art appears suddenly in the archaeological record around this time, not as crude beginnings, but as sophisticated expressions that show advanced planning, symbolic thinking, and aesthetic sensibility. Complex burial practices emerge, indicating abstract concepts about death, afterlife, and spiritual existence. Evidence for long-distance trade and cultural exchange multiplies, suggesting expanded social networks and communication systems. But perhaps most importantly, humans began to exhibit what researchers call behavioral modernity, the full package of abilities that distinguishes modern humans from all other species, past and present. This includes the ability to plan for distant future events, to think about abstract concepts, to use symbols to represent ideas, and to cooperate on projects that require coordination across multiple generations. The timing of this revolution corresponds almost exactly with the period when humans began their great expansion out of Africa and across the globe. Within a few thousand years, humans had reached Australia, which required ocean crossings and sophisticated boat-building technology. They had spread across Asia, adapted to Arctic conditions in Siberia, and were beginning the colonization of the Americas. This wasn't gradual diffusion, but rapid expansion that suggests qualitatively different capabilities than humans had possessed before. They weren't just following animal herds or being pushed by population pressure. They were actively exploring and colonizing new environments with remarkable speed and success. Some scientists believe this behavioral revolution was triggered by a genetic mutation that enhanced cognitive abilities, perhaps changes in brain structure that improved working memory, planning ability, or linguistic capacity. The fact that it appears to have happened relatively suddenly and then spread rapidly across all human populations suggests some kind of biological change that provided significant advantages. Others argue that it was a cultural tipping point, that once human societies reached a certain level of complexity and population density, innovation began to accelerate exponentially. Ideas could spread more rapidly, building on each other to create increasingly sophisticated technologies and social systems. The truth probably involves both biological and cultural factors working together. Genetic changes may have provided the cognitive foundation for more complex behavior, while cultural innovations created environments where those capabilities could be fully expressed and developed. What's clear is that this period represents the emergence of humans as we recognize them today. The people living 50,000 years ago had the same cognitive abilities we do. They can learn to use computers, understand mathematics, appreciate art, and participate in complex social institutions if raised in modern environments. But they were using those abilities in ways we can barely imagine. They were creating solutions to survival challenges that required integrating knowledge from dozens of different domains, understanding animal behavior, plant ecology, geology, meteorology, physics, chemistry, and human psychology, all at the same time. They were developing social systems that could coordinate the activities of hundreds of people across vast distances without written communication, formal governments, or coercive institutions. They created cultural traditions that could transmit essential knowledge across dozens of generations with remarkable fidelity while still allowing for innovation and adaptation. They were beginning to think about questions that had never occurred to any previous species. Questions about meaning, purpose, beauty, and humanity's place in the cosmos. They were creating art, not for survival, but for the pure human pleasure of creation and expression. This cognitive revolution enabled everything that followed in human history. Agriculture, cities, writing, mathematics, science, philosophy, and technology all became possible because humans had developed the mental capabilities that emerged during this period. But in many ways, the people living 50,000 years ago were using these capabilities more fully than we do today. They were generalists who had to master dozens of different skills and knowledge domains. They were deeply connected to their natural environment in ways that gave them intimate understanding of ecological relationships. They lived in communities where every individual was known personally and had important roles to play. They created sustainable lifestyles that could have continued indefinitely without depleting the resources they depended on. They developed social systems that ensured no one was left behind and everyone had security and purpose. They found ways to satisfy basic human needs for meaning, beauty, community, and spiritual connection that many modern people struggle to achieve. Understanding this period helps us recognize that many of the problems we consider fundamental to human nature: inequality, environmental destruction, social isolation, meaninglessness, aren't inevitable consequences of being human. They're products of particular social and economic systems that developed much later in human history. The cognitive abilities that emerged 50,000 years ago gave humans incredible flexibility and adaptability. We use those abilities to create agriculture and civilization, but we could use them just as easily to create very different kinds of societies if we chose to do so. To truly grasp the magnitude of this transformation, we need to step back and consider what human existence was like before this pivotal moment. For nearly 200,000 years, anatomically modern humans had existed on Earth. Their brains were the same size as ours, their skeletal structure virtually identical. They possessed the same fundamental capacity for intelligence that we do today. Yet for the vast majority of those millennia, human behavior remained remarkably static. Archaeological sites from 100,000 years ago show humans who were clearly intelligent. They made tools, controlled fire, hunted large game, and lived in organized social groups. But there's something missing from these ancient records, something that distinguishes them from what came after. The tools they made, while effective, followed patterns that remained unchanged for tens of thousands of years. There's little evidence of experimentation, innovation, or the kind of rapid technological development that would become humanity's hallmark. More tellingly, there's almost no evidence of what we might call unnecessary behavior, activities that went beyond immediate survival needs. No art, no decoration, no symbols, no evidence of ritual or ceremony beyond the most basic burial practices. These early humans were survivors, certainly, but they weren't yet the creative, meaning-making creatures we recognize as fully human. What happened around 50,000 years ago wasn't just an increase in intelligence. It was the emergence of a fundamentally different kind of consciousness. Scientists call this the development of behavioral modernity, but that clinical term barely captures the profound transformation that occurred. This wasn't a sudden transformation that happened overnight, but it was remarkably rapid in evolutionary terms. Within a few thousand years, humans went from being very intelligent animals with sophisticated tool use to being creatures capable of abstract thought, symbolic communication, artistic expression, and complex social organization. The nature of this consciousness shift is perhaps best understood through what cognitive scientists call metacognition, the ability to think about thinking itself. Pre-revolutionary humans could solve complex problems, but they couldn't step back and analyze their own thought processes, couldn't imagine alternative ways of approaching problems, couldn't conceive of knowledge as something that could be accumulated and improved across generations. This metacognitive leap enabled what researchers call cumulative cultural evolution, the ability for each generation to build upon the innovations of previous ones, creating an exponential acceleration in human capability. For the first time, human knowledge began to grow faster than it could be forgotten. Tools didn't just serve their immediate purpose. They became platforms for developing even better tools. But perhaps even more significant was the development of what we might call temporal consciousness, the ability to exist mentally in multiple time frames simultaneously. These revolutionary humans could vividly imagine future scenarios, plan for events that might occur years or decades in the future, and learn from the experiences of ancestors they had never met. They began to see themselves as part of a continuous story that extended far beyond their individual lifespans. The evidence for this transformation is everywhere once you know how to look for it. Before about 50,000 years ago, human technology remained relatively static for long periods. The same basic tool types appear in archaeological sites for tens of thousands of years with only minor modifications. After this period, technological innovation accelerated dramatically, with new tool types appearing and spreading rapidly across vast distances. Consider the Hauisen's port industry from South Africa, dating to around 60,000 years ago. Here we find some of the earliest evidence of truly innovative thinking: tiny, precisely crafted stone points that were hafted onto spears and arrows using complex adhesives made from tree resins, mixed with ochre and other materials. The sophistication of these composite tools required not just technical skill, but the ability to plan multiple steps ahead, to understand the properties of different materials, and to innovate solutions to complex engineering problems. Even more remarkable are the workshops where these tools were made. Archaeological evidence shows that raw materials were transported from locations up to 200 kilometers away, suggesting trade networks, forward planning, and social cooperation on a scale never before seen. Toolmakers were specializing in different aspects of production, with some sites focused on initial stone working, others on fine finishing, and still others on the production of adhesives and hafting materials. This wasn't just functional innovation, it was the beginning of human aesthetic sensibility. Many of these early tools show evidence of decorative elements that serve no practical purpose. Symmetrical designs, careful finishing of surfaces that would never be seen, the selection of particularly beautiful stones for tools that worked no better than plainer alternatives. Humans were beginning to create beauty for its own sake. The same pattern appears in every aspect of human behavior. Art appears suddenly in the archaeological record around this time, not as crude beginnings, but as sophisticated expressions that show advanced planning, symbolic thinking, and aesthetic sensibility. Complex burial practices emerge, indicating abstract concepts about death, afterlife, and spiritual existence. Evidence for long-distance trade and cultural exchange multiplies, suggesting expanded social networks and communication systems. The cave paintings at Chauvet in France, created around 32,000 years ago, provide perhaps the most stunning evidence of this cognitive revolution. These aren't simple representations, they're sophisticated artistic compositions that demonstrate advanced understanding of perspective, movement, and narrative storytelling. The artists who created these works were using techniques like shading and perspective that wouldn't be rediscovered until the Renaissance. But even more significant are the abstract symbols that begin appearing in the archaeological record around this time. Geometric patterns carved into bone and stone. Series of lines and dots that clearly represent some form of notation or counting system. And most intriguingly, what appear to be the earliest forms of written communication at Blombos Cave in South Africa. Archaeologists have found pieces of ochre inscribed with complex geometric patterns dating to 70,000 years ago. These aren't accidental marks. They're carefully planned designs that required considerable skill to execute. More importantly, they represent the first evidence of humans creating symbols to represent abstract concepts. The foundation of all written language and mathematical thinking. The implications of symbolic thinking cannot be overstated. Once humans could use symbols to represent ideas, they could think about concepts that had no physical existence. They could imagine gods and spirits, contemplate mathematical relationships, create stories about the past and future, and develop complex moral and philosophical systems. This period also saw the emergence of unprecedented social complexity. Pre-revolutionary human groups were probably similar in organization to modern hunter-gatherer societies, small bands of related individuals sharing resources and making decisions collectively. But the archaeological record from 50,000 years ago onwards shows evidence of much larger, more complex social structures. Sites like Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, occupied around 26,000 years ago, show evidence of communities with hundreds of individuals living together in elaborate settlements with specialized buildings for different activities. There were workshops for tool-making, areas for food preparation and storage, and what appear to be ceremonial spaces for ritual activities. These communities required new forms of social organization, decision-making systems that could coordinate the activities of hundreds of people, methods for resolving conflicts without destroying social cohesion, and ways of maintaining group identity and cooperation across multiple generations. They developed sophisticated systems of reciprocity and exchange that could maintain relationships across vast distances and long periods of time. But perhaps most importantly, humans began to exhibit what researchers call behavioral modernity, the full package of abilities that distinguishes modern humans from all other species, past and present. This includes the ability to plan for distant future events, to think about abstract concepts, to use symbols to represent ideas, and to cooperate on projects that require coordination across multiple generations. The development of behavioral modernity represented a viva madura, qualitative leap in human capability that goes far beyond simple intelligence. Consider the level of abstract thinking required for some of the activities that first appeared during this period. Humans began creating calendars, systematic methods for tracking seasonal changes that required understanding mathematical relationships between celestial movements and earthly cycles. They developed complex mythologies and oral traditions that could preserve essential information across dozens of generations. These weren't simple stories, but sophisticated information storage systems that embedded practical knowledge about navigation, weather patterns, animal behavior, and social relationships within compelling narratives that people would remember and pass on faithfully.